Imagine being told that your very life, your freedom, and your future could be controlled by a rule so cruel, so hidden, that it could ruin you before you even had a chance to live. A tradition that shaped the destiny of countless women, yet few have ever heard of it. This was reality in the Ottoman Empire. But what exactly was this tradition, and why did it continue for centuries despite the suffering it caused? Today, we uncover a story of control, fear, and injustice that has been buried in history until now. The Ottoman Empire, a name that evokes images of grandeur, power, and centuries of influence stretching across Europe, Asia, and Africa. From the early 14th century to the early 20th century, this empire ruled millions of people, boasting unmatched wealth, architectural marvels, and a military feared by the world. But behind the splendor of the palaces, the intricate mosaics, and the bustling markets, there was a darker reality, one that especially affected women. Life for women in the Ottoman Empire was governed by rules, rituals, and traditions, some practical, some protective, but others devastatingly oppressive. Society demanded obedience, honor, and a strict adherence to a system designed to maintain control. Families, particularly fathers and husbands, wielded immense authority, and women often bore the brunt of the consequences for any perceived misstep. And then there were the traditions, rituals so deeply embedded in daily life that breaking them was almost unthinkable. Yet some of these practices were far from benign. They were dangerous, manipulative, and even life-altering. One such tradition, hidden in the shadows of history, would leave a trail of suffering that reverberated through generations. This was more than just social expectation. It was a tool of control. Women were constantly monitored, restricted, and judged, not just by their families, but by society itself. Their lives, their choices, even their fates were dictated by rules they had no power to challenge. What made this tradition particularly cruel was how it blended secrecy with authority. It was a system that thrived in silence, reinforced by fear, shame, and the rigid hierarchies of Ottoman society. And while the empire was renowned for its law, culture, and military might, this particular tradition exposed a dark underbelly, the human cost of maintaining order at any price. By the end of this story, we'll see how one practice, so normalized that it was almost invisible, could destroy lives, shape destinies, and leave scars that lasted long after the empire itself had faded. But before we uncover the full extent of this tradition, we need to understand the world in which it existed, the Ottoman social structure, the roles women were expected to play, and the powerful forces that made obedience a matter of survival. Only then can we truly grasp the horror, the cunning, and the impact of a rule that the empire allowed and enforced. For most women in the Ottoman Empire, life was defined by boundaries. Physical, social, and moral boundaries shaped everything from childhood to adulthood. Girls were expected to grow up learning obedience, humility, and loyalty, not just to their families, but to the empire itself. Family honor was everything. The reputation of a household could hinge on the behavior of its daughters. A single mistake, or even the rumor of one, could bring shame not just to a woman, but to her entire family. Fathers, brothers, and husbands were entrusted with upholding this honor, and women were taught from a young age that their value was measured by their compliance. Marriage was often the ultimate goal, but in the Ottoman world, it wasn't just about love or companionship. It was a transaction, a social contract, and sometimes a trap. Women were expected to be perfect daughters, obedient wives, and dutiful mothers, roles that were enforced by rigid laws and long-standing traditions. It's within this context that the dark tradition we're about to reveal thrived. Unlike laws written on scrolls or decrees enforced by soldiers, this was a practice that operated in private homes, in whispers behind palace doors, and in the quiet corners of Ottoman streets. It affected women of every class, from peasants to princesses. No amount of wealth or status could fully protect a woman from its reach. And while the empire celebrated its grandeur, the reality was stark. Women were often powerless, trapped in a system that prioritized obedience and honor over humanity and compassion. So, what was this tradition? How could something so ingrained in society cause so much suffering? And why did the empire allow it to continue for centuries, even as the world around it changed? By exploring the lives of women who lived under this shadow, we begin to understand the full scope of its cruelty. Their stories reveal fear, courage, and resilience, and they paint a picture of a society where control came at the cost of lives and dreams. The tradition we're talking about is something so chilling that by today's standards, it would seem unimaginable. In the Ottoman Empire, there existed a practice designed to monitor, control, and, at times, punish women in a way that ensured their obedience and reinforced male authority. This was the system of virginity verification and the policing of purity, a tradition deeply intertwined with honor, family reputation, and societal control. While it might sound simple on paper, its execution was cruel, invasive, and devastating. From a young age, girls were conditioned to understand that their value, and often the survival of their family's honor, depended on their chastity. Families, in some cases, enlisted midwives or elders to secretly inspect young women before marriage. The most infamous ritual occurred on the wedding night, where women were expected to prove their virginity in front of family witnesses. Imagine the fear, the shame, and the anxiety. Women were not only expected to meet these impossible standards, they had no privacy, no choice, and no recourse if the tests failed. Even rumors of imperfection could lead to public humiliation, rejection, or worse. It wasn't just about proving purity, it was about control. Men, fathers, and husbands used this practice to assert dominance, while families wielded it to maintain social respectability. And because it was tied so closely to honor, the consequences for women were often catastrophic. Some were disowned, beaten, or even killed. Others faced lifelong stigma, unable to marry or reintegrate into society. But perhaps the most sinister aspect was the silence surrounding it. This tradition was rarely written about in official records, yet it thrived in whispers, in private homes, and behind palace doors. It was the perfect tool for maintaining power, invisible to outsiders, yet devastating for those trapped by it. And while some women found ways to escape or hide the truth, the risk was enormous. One failed inspection, one false rumor could destroy a woman's life entirely. To truly understand why this tradition existed, we must step back and look at the society that created it. The Ottoman Empire was built on hierarchy, religion, and social norms. Honor and family reputation were not just cultural values, they were social currency. Women were expected to embody purity, obedience, and virtue, while men were granted freedom, authority, and dominance. The tradition of virginity verification and the policing of women's bodies more broadly was seen as a safeguard of this social order. Families believed that protecting honor meant controlling women's choices, mobility, and sexuality. Yet this control came at a tremendous human cost. Girls were raised in fear, mothers often became enforcers, and men wielded authority with impunity. Some historians estimate that thousands of women suffered under these practices, their lives constrained by a system that treated them as property rather than human beings. This system also created intense psychological pressure. Women learned to internalize fear and shame from childhood. Curiosity, desire, or even natural mistakes could result in punishment or public disgrace. But the tradition persisted because it worked, not morally, but practically, within the society's terms. It reinforced male authority, ensured family honor, and maintained societal control. Communities collectively turned a blind eye to the suffering it caused, because to challenge it was to threaten the very foundation of social order. Resistance existed, of course, but it was dangerous. Some women tried to marry in secret, flee, or hide evidence of nonconformity, risking exile or death. Others suffered silently, accepting their fate, because the cost of defiance was simply too high. Even in elite Ottoman circles, women in harems and palaces were subject to these controls. Princesses and noblewomen could face inspections and scrutiny to prove their purity before marriage, reminding us that wealth or status offered little protection. The question that hung over every household was the same. Could a woman ever escape this control? Or was she doomed from birth to a life defined by fear? The consequences of this tradition were horrifying, both physically and emotionally. Some women faced public humiliation, paraded in front of family or neighbors if suspected of dishonor. Others endured beatings, confinement, or worse, often without any hope of justice. Stories passed down through history describe the psychological toll in vivid detail. Women lived in constant fear, never fully trusting friends, family, or even their future husbands. Anxiety, depression, and despair were widespread, but rarely acknowledged. For many, the ultimate punishment was social death. Women who failed to meet the impossible standards could be ostracized, forced into exile, or denied marriage entirely. Some were sent to convents, others into servitude, their lives forever marked by shame. Yet the horror wasn't limited to physical punishment. Families and communities reinforced a culture of shame, teaching girls from an early age that their worth was tied solely to compliance. Mothers often became the enforcers, passing down the trauma from one generation to the next. The tradition created a cycle of oppression, fear, and silence. Even those who conformed were not truly safe. One false accusation, one rumor, or one misstep could destroy their lives. And because the practice was tied to honor, there was no official record of wrongdoing, no recourse, only consequences. It is difficult to overstate the emotional weight of this tradition. Women lived under constant scrutiny, their bodies and choices never entirely their own. The empire's obsession with control turned ordinary households into sites of surveillance and fear. Despite the danger, some women resisted. Some found ways to escape through arranged marriages, bribery, or flight. Others rebelled in smaller, quieter ways, refusing inspections, speaking out, or quietly subverting the system. But these acts of defiance were rare and always dangerous. The empire, meanwhile, had no incentive to change. For centuries, this tradition maintained control, social order, and male dominance. The suffering it caused was ignored, silenced, and normalized. And while history often glorifies the Ottoman Empire for its power and wealth, the hidden cost, borne largely by women, remains a shadow of its grandeur. To truly grasp why this oppressive tradition persisted for centuries, we have to look at the forces of power behind it. The Ottoman Empire was not only a military superpower, it was also a carefully structured social machine, and every part of society was designed to maintain hierarchy and control. Women were the most visible markers of honor and obedience, making them a critical point of control for families, rulers, and even the state. By enforcing these strict traditions, the empire ensured that social order remained intact and that loyalty to family, religion, and empire was unquestionable. At the highest levels, the empire's rulers understood that control over women meant control over families, and by extension, entire communities. Noble families who ignored these customs risked losing favor, influence, and sometimes even their property. Ordinary families who failed to enforce these rules risked shame, ostracism, or worse. In elite circles, the consequences were equally strict. Women in harems and palaces were often inspected or monitored to ensure purity before marriage, not just as a cultural formality, but as a political necessity. A scandal could destabilize alliances, threaten inheritance, or weaken the power of a ruling family. The practice also reinforced male authority at every level. Fathers, husbands, and even brothers were given the power to enforce compliance, while women internalized fear and obedience as part of survival. The empire didn't have to use its armies or legal system to maintain this control. The tradition itself acted as a silent, self-perpetuating tool of governance. Historians note that while some laws were codified in Ottoman legal texts, many traditions like these existed in a gray area of social enforcement. They were unwritten, yet universally understood. They thrived because questioning them meant risking both social and personal ruin. What makes this particularly haunting is that the victims were never officially recognized. No court records documented their suffering. No official decree acknowledged the injustice. And yet, these women's lives were dictated, constrained, and often destroyed because of a system designed to maintain control and order. No empire lasts forever, and the Ottoman Empire was no exception. By the 19th century, social and political pressures began to challenge the traditions that had dominated women's lives for centuries. Western influence, modernization efforts, and reforms introduced by Ottoman leaders slowly began to undermine the foundations of this oppressive practice. The empire began to codify laws, create educational reforms, and gradually shift cultural norms, though not without resistance. Urban centers like Istanbul and Izmir saw the rise of schools for girls, opportunities for women to learn skills beyond domestic work, and new social spaces that allowed women to assert a degree of independence. For the first time in centuries, women could hope for a life not strictly controlled by family honor or ritual inspections. But change was slow. In rural areas, the tradition continued well into the late 19th and even early 20th centuries. Deeply entrenched beliefs about honor and virtue did not disappear overnight. Many families clung to the old system, fearing social backlash if they allowed women autonomy or broke from tradition. Still, cracks in the system began to appear. Legal reforms, combined with growing public awareness, started to protect women from the most invasive practices. Marriage inspections became less common, and the idea of policing women's bodies for the sake of honor gradually lost its legitimacy. Yet, even as the practice faded, its legacy of fear and trauma remained. Women who grew up under these traditions carried the scars for the rest of their lives. The stories of those who resisted, survived, or were destroyed serve as a haunting reminder of the human cost of social control. The empire itself would collapse in the early 20th century, but the cultural and psychological remnants of these practices lingered, influencing family dynamics, gender roles, and societal expectations long after the Ottoman flag was lowered for the final time. Even today, historians and social scientists look back at this tradition to understand how power, fear, and control can shape societies. The Ottoman example reminds us that seemingly invisible or cultural practices can have devastating consequences when left unchallenged. Women's stories from this era offer lessons in resilience and survival, but they also highlight the dangers of unquestioned authority. The tradition destroyed lives, limited potential, and silenced voices, and yet it persisted because no one dared speak out. By studying this history, we see parallels in societies across the world where women's autonomy is still restricted and where honor, tradition, or social expectation can outweigh basic human rights. It forces us to ask difficult questions. How many lives have been shaped or ruined by customs we accept without questioning? What can history teach us about the price of silence and obedience? This story is more than a tale of the past. It is a reminder that control over women's lives has real consequences, both for individuals and for society as a whole. And while the Ottoman Empire may be gone, the echoes of these traditions remind us why it is so important to protect freedom, equality, and human dignity today. As we close this chapter, we honor the women who endured this tradition, the lives that were lost, and the courage of those who resisted. Their stories may have been hidden for centuries, but now, through history, we remember and we learn.